Well, good morning. I appreciate all of you joining me again this Friday, the 9th of April. Hope you all had a great Passover and/or Easter last weekend. So you might recall in our last lecture, we examined the Greek War of Independence by exploring the lives of two of Greece's greatest national heroes, Bouboulina, the famous fiery female admiral who spent most of her fortune by building ships for the Greek Navy, and the so-called old man of the Morea, Theodoros Kolokotronis, who would emerge as Greece's greatest commander-in-chief. Now, this week, I want to examine some of the most horrific battles that took place during the Greek War of Independence. So this week's lecture is entitled The Horrors of War, the Siege of Missolonghi, and the Massacre at Chios. So as the Greek War of Independence began, many of the Philhellenic supporters of the Greek War of Independence, poets like Lord Byron, lionized the Greek achievement. They glorified the kleptic bands and the Maniotis warriors as these champions of freedom who were trying to vanquish the infidels, the evil Ottoman Turks who wanted to snuff out Orthodox Christendom. Many of these Philhellenes were looking back to the glory days of ancient Greece, when the Athenians were looked upon as the liberators of Greece, the great victors over the tyrannical Persian despots. So freedom versus tyranny. That's how the great hagiographic narratives were written. So hagiography, just sort of a nice Greek word meaning saintly writing, trying to present historical narratives in sort of the overtop glorious light, if you will. So it is true that in the historical record that is preserved, that the most atrocious acts that took place during the Greek War of Independence were committed by the Ottoman Turks on the Greek population. But again, the Greeks themselves were guilty, especially during the early years of the war, especially as the Greek War of Independence was played out in the major theater of operation, namely the Morea, the former name of the Peloponnese. The Greeks themselves were guilty of some very horrific acts. And this shouldn't come as any surprise. The Greeks, of course, had been oppressed for 4 centuries. There was a long history of bloodletting, vendettas, family feuds. These kleptic bands and the warriors from the mountains of the Mani had a history of violence. So we do have to sort of balance the historical record by pointing out that the Greeks themselves were guilty of brutality. And we did see this, of course, in the siege of Tripolitsa. This is the present-day city of Tripoli in the Peloponnese. In the 19th century, it was the capital of the Morea. And as you might expect, there was a sizable Turkish population. Many of the noble Ottoman families dwelt in Tripolitsa. And during the siege of Tripolitsa in the spring of 1821, the Greeks did massacre thousands of Ottomans. Um, Estimates are always difficult to pinpoint, but a number of around 20,000 is probably reasonable. But not just the Ottomans, but Albanians, and also Jewish and Christian citizens, those that were seen in the eyes of the Greek warriors as supporters of the Ottoman Turks, were also slaughtered as well. So before we examine the great massacres that were inflicted upon the Greek population, it's important to um, accept the fact that the Greeks themselves were guilty of some horrible acts of violence. So one of the bloodiest attacks on the Greek population took place in June of 1824 on the island of Psara. This destruction of this island, which is located here in the northern Aegean Sea, it's not far from the island of Chios. This is generally regarded as one of the biggest blows to the Greek rebellion. Now, the Ottoman fleet that attacked Psara consisted of about 175 Ottoman warships and transports that could carry upwards of 17,000 Turkish troops, as well as Albanian mercenaries. Defending the small island of Psara were about 1,300 fighters, as well as some refugees from some of the neighboring islands, as well as mercenaries from Macedonia and northern Greece, namely the region of Thessaly. Now, a year before, in 1823, the Ottoman admiral Yusuf Mehmet had made efforts to persuade the Greek naval leaders to abandon the revolution and concentrate on their lucrative commerce alone. But these efforts came to nothing, particularly in the case of the islanders of Psara, who had carried out devastating raids on the Turkish cities of Smyrna, that's present-day Izmir in western Turkey, and also the city of Ivali on the coast of Asia Minor. Psara had become very famous because of the daring exploits of its revolutionary hero, Canaris. But by early 1824, the Sultan, back in Constantinople, back at the Sublime Porte, the royal court, had decided to destroy Psara. He didn't want to attack the island of Hydra or Spetses because of their large fleets and their proximity to the Peloponnese, where strong military support was available. But Psara was an exposed island lying just a few miles, as you can see, to the northwest of the island of Chios, and therefore a considerable distance and several days' sail from the other naval islands that were close to the mainland of Greece. Now, Psara had about 100 ships in its fleet, so they represented a good threat to the Turks' naval enterprises in this part of the Aegean. In preparation for battle with the Ottoman Turks, the people of Psara, the Psarans, had already set up cannon emplacements and had dug trenches all along their beaches, both on the north and southern regions of the island of Psara. So well-prepared defenses, but for whatever reason, the Psaran leaders decided to do something that was rather stupid. They decided to remove the rudders from their ships. For whatever reason, the mercenaries from Macedonia said, we don't want rudders on the ships. So in effect, that made the ships kind of useless. So again, it's hard to understand why this decision was made, but naval bombardment began on the island. The Turks were lobbing lots of cannonballs, especially on the southern beaches, and they were initially unable to land their infantry ashore, but that eventually they did find a remote sort of outpost on the southeast area of Psara called Kavo Markaki, and there the Turkish forces disembarked and began crushing the Thessalians and the Macedonian mercenaries and began wholesale to slaughter the citizenry of Psara. And it was a real bloody, gruesome battle that ensued. Chroniclers report the streets, the major towns of Psara were strewn with the corpses of old men and women left dead, even children. And with the rudders removed from the fleet, the villagers couldn't escape by boat. So on the 5th of July, 1824, lots of bloodshed. More than half the population of Psara, estimated at around 30,000, was decimated or sold off as slaves. Again, there are some records that have been preserved, from census records that took place after the massacre. Maybe something like 18,000 were slaughtered or sold as slaves. But Psara never recovered. It never again had a sizable population. It never went over 7,000 inhabitants. Of the 100 ships of the Psarans, only 16 managed to escape, as well as some 7 of the fire ships. Now, there's a very interesting story that came out of the massacre on the island of Psara, and it has to deal with this young boy here, shown when he was, it's a painting actually, of a 10-year-old boy by the name of George Syrian. And he would go on to become a very, very important naval officer in the United States Navy. So young George was born on the island of Psara in 1818, but he became an orphan in July of 1824 when Psara, his island, was besieged by the Ottoman Turks. He was able to get off the island just in time. His mother made sure of that. But we are told that he actually saw his mother killed on the beach of Psara as he was making his way to safety. Eventually, he would be rescued by the US Navy. Now, this, of course, took place during the administration of our 5th president, James Monroe. From the historical records that have been preserved at this time, we know he joined the famous warship, the USS Constitution, in May of 1827, when he was 9 years of age, and he served as a cabin boy or a powder monkey, as some of these young men were called. He supplied the gunpowder. He helped the gunners fill the cannons with gunpowder. Eventually, he would be adopted by a Constitution officer by the name of Robert Randolph, who took him back to the United States, to the city of Boston, where he reared him and had him educated. Here, the boy learned English, history, military history, mathematics, etc. Eventually, Robert Randolph had him taken to a naval officer, a Greek American by the name of George Marshall, who was born on the Greek island of Rhodes. Marshall was considered the greatest gunner of the military. In fact, he wrote the first manual for the Navy on gunnery. It was a practical guide. And eventually, young George became an acting gunner at the naval base at Portsmouth and Virginia. And he would go on to have a very, very distinguished career, one which lasted nearly 54 years. He had no less than 37 tours of duty, 3 alone on the U.S. Constitution and scores of other ships, 3 separate tours of duty on the famous Old Ironsides. He died at the age of 73 in 1891 and was posthumously inducted in the Surface Navy Hall of Fame about 14 years ago. And there's even an award that's given annually in his honor, the George Syrian Surface Naval Hall Award. To the right, you see the transfer papers to the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where he served in the capacity of a gunner. So very interesting history about this Greek orphan who was rescued and would go on to become a U.S. citizen and one of the most distinguished sailors in the United States Navy, George Sirion. So we turn now to what most historians consider the most gruesome event that was played out during the Greek War of Independence. And it took place on the island of Chios. At what time it was occupied by the Italians, and they called it Schio. The island of Chios lay off the western coast of Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and it was one of the most prized possessions of the Ottoman Empire. Chios was the richest and most peaceful of the Greek islands. Its prosperity resulted from the production of mastic. Now, this was a very rare plant found only on the island of Chios. There were some mastic plants that were found along the coast of Asia Minor, but mostly on the island of Chios. And even today, mastic is produced on Chios. Today, as then, it's used for chewing gum, no less. So way back during Ottoman times, it was not uncommon for young Turkish girls to chew mastic gum. sort of like chewing tobacco, which their male counterparts did, but we find young Turkish women chewing mastic gum. Also, the young women of Chios also chewed mastic gum. And mastic was also used for other purposes as a mouthwash, as a digestive, for had some therapeutic properties. It was used in baking, and it was a very, very lucrative product for the Chians. And today, mastic products are still widely sold. You can purchase them online. So Chios, again, not only for the mastic trade, but it also was given special rights by the Sublime Porte, uh, exclusive rights of commerce, and it made it fabulously wealthy. So the Chians initially, although a number of their neighboring islands, like the island of Samos, actually where my grandparents, my maternal grandparents were born, were in full revolt against the Ottomans. But the Chians were really reluctant. They didn't want to undermine their commerce and their trade. Lying so close to the Turkish coast, as you might expect, they were very much fearful of their loss of security. Again, being so close to Anatolia, it was not difficult for the Ottomans to send a fleet and vanquish them. But everything began to change around March of 1822, when the nearby island of Samos sent a delegation led by a famous commander, a Samian commander by the name of Lycurgus Logothetes. And he tried to force the local Chians to join them against the Ottoman Turks. And when the Sultan became aware of the Chians now wanting to support the Greek cause, he became absolutely infuriated because, again, he had given the people of Chios so many special privileges. So here are a couple of good maps. Again, the island of Sara, which is here, but here in red is again, the island of Chios. Now, I forgot to mention, Chios is purportedly the birthplace of Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, supposedly born on the island of Chios. But right here, you can see the island of Chios. Down here is where most of the production of mastic takes place on the southern region of the island of Chios. So the Sultan's reaction was very prompt and decisive. So in late March of 1822, he sent some 40,000 Turkish troops, actually even more than that, to destroy Chios and wipe out the entire population. And on Good Friday, the 13th of April, Friday the 13th, the Sultan ordered the wholesale killing, rape, and burning of the island and its plunder. And over the next 2 weeks, the poor Greek people would suffer horribly at the hands of the Ottomans. Troops were ordered to kill all babies under the age of 3, males over the age of 12, women over the age of 40, with the exception of those who would bow down to Allah, convert to Islam. horrible events were played out all over the island. One of the most horrific was the burning alive of some 2,000 islanders who had made their way to the mountain sanctuary of Nea Moni. 2,000 of them were burnt alive. Now, again, it's very difficult to ascertain the exact population, anywhere between maybe 100,000 to 120,000. So it's a very sizable island, wealthy island, as I mentioned. Um, at least 70% of the population was wiped out, maybe 80% of the white population. So the population may have been reduced to 20,000. Again, it would never fully recover, but somewhere in the order of 40 to 50,000 Kians were butchered alive. Maybe 50,000 were exiled and sold to the slave markets of Asia Minor. Some 2,000 of the islanders maybe survived, some of them making their way by boat, some of them hiding in mountain villages or in caves. And many of them became part of one of the many diaspora of the Greek people, but this one, the Chian diaspora. So many of them made their way to cities of Europe, in particular cities like Berlin, Vienna. Some of them did make their way to the United States, as we mentioned. But then there was some revenge that took place just a couple of months later. A native of Chios who had survived, burnt the Turkish fleet, during which about 2,000 Turks died, and all of the remaining Turkish ships were destroyed. So here you have a very stark image. These are actually remains, skulls and bones of Chians who were slaughtered during the massacre. These are located in a museum in the capital of Chios, and it's an ossuary cabinet. See the skulls and the bones, just some of the victims of the massacre on Chios. So this horrific event, this horrible bloodshed that the Greeks suffered on the island of Chios, really enraged citizens throughout Europe and the United States. The Philhellenes were more than ever now supportive of the Greek liberation movement. And there were a number of accounts written describing this horrible massacre that took place. A lot of money was collected by Philhellenes and many of their societies and organizations in support of the Greek cause. So many of the Philhellenic committees throughout Europe, in particular in France and Great Britain and Germany, collected money and recruited volunteers to travel to Greece in defense of the Greek liberation movement. So as I mentioned before, European chroniclers tended to focus almost exclusively on the atrocities of the Ottomans against the Orthodox Christians. And there were a number of poems and stories glorifying the nobility of the Chians dying at the hands of the Ottomans, and famous paintings as well that served as a form of propaganda to rally support for the Greek cause. And the most famous is this one you see in the upper left-hand corner, the famous Massacre of Chios. The French word is Schio, again, the Italian variant for the island of Chios, but it was painted by the great Romanticist artist Eugene Delacroix. And it's shown in graphic detail the suffering of the Greeks, brutally mowed down by the Ottoman Turks. And it was presented for the first time at one of the great salons of Paris, where romanticist paintings were unveiled. And it really had a huge psychological impact on the Europeans who saw it, just filled with pathos, poignancy, very powerful interpretation. Now, at the time, there was also a lot of focus on the horrible slave trade. Great Britain had recently outlawed the international slave trade. So there was this association made between the horrible suffering, the brutal attacks on the Greeks by the Turks, showing them as victims too, like slaves, horrible treatment of the slaves parallels now with the suffering of the Greeks. So this painting, as you might expect, aroused a lot of sympathy for the Greek cause. And again, it helped to mobilize support in the Greek struggle for independence. So the Greeks also suffered horribly in central Greece at the strategic port town of Missolonghi. Now, you'll recall we discussed Lord Byron, who himself fought alongside the Greeks at Missolonghi. So he fought during the second siege of Missolonghi, which took place in 1823. The engagement we're talking about today is the so-called third siege of Missolonghi, and it was by far the most brutal. Now, Missolonghi was, again, a strategically located town, located on a promontory in the Gulf of Patras. So that's the body of water to the west of the entrance of the Gulf of Corinth. So as you might imagine, extremely important to the Greek cause. And more than anything, the Ottoman Turks were determined to take this town where one of the regional governments of the Greeks had been established. So the Turks were unsuccessful in capturing it in 1822 and again in 1823, where Lord Byron fought, but they would be successful in the 1-year siege of Missolonghi that took place from the 15th of April, 1825, and lasted for nearly a year, April 10th of 1826. Continuous bombardment by the Ottomans, as well as by Egyptian mercenaries, horrible sights of elderly people and young children dying of starvation each day. Even the dogs and the cats and the donkeys had been eaten. But eventually, the realization on the part of the Greek holdouts at Missolonghi that no further aid would come to the Greeks. Now, I should mention that the British governor of those Western Greek islands, known as the Ionian Islands, the British governor, Frederick Adam, had attempted to broker a deal, but that collapsed. And the Ottomans, over the course of the year, were able effectively to completely cut off the supply line. No food, no armaments were able to make their way to the poor villagers of the city of Missolonghi. So, of the some 9,000 civilians, nearly a quarter of them were just too weak to fight by the middle of April of 1826. We even have incidences of Missolongans actually blowing themselves up in the arsenals rather than surrendering to the Turks. And then a horrible event took place that concludes the fall of Missolonghi, and that was the attempted mass exodus of the people. Now, there had been a plan that had been laid whereby the army at Missolonghi that still existed would create a diversion just north of the city while those inhabitants tried to escape en masse. Unfortunately, the plan was betrayed by a fellow Greek who was bribed, and the villagers were unaware of this act of betrayal. So when they attempted their mass exodus, 7,000 of them were slaughtered, many taken into slavery, sold off at the slave markets. The Ottoman Turks, as a warning to other would-be rebels, displayed 3,000 heads on spikes or on the city walls. They were festooned along the city walls of Missolonghi as trophies. But just as the massacre at Chios, more than anything, rallied the Philhellenes to champion the Greek cause and support the Greek cause, so too did the horrible massacre at Missolonghi play a huge role in the eventual intervention of the great powers of Europe, who would eventually support the Greek cause and were so instrumental in the eventual victory of the Greeks over the Turks. So Russia, Britain, and France now were very much spurred into action by the events at Missolonghi. And Delacroix, Eugene Delacroix, painted this famous image of the personification of Greece, this beautiful woman, kind of a Virgin Mary-like image, but familiar to French revolutionists as female liberty, beautifully represented here standing on the ruins of Missolonghi. So liberty eventually triumphing over the forces of tyranny and despotism in Delacroix's very powerful image called Greece on the Ruins of Missolonghi. I just wanted to show you quickly where Missolonghi is located. So here you see it on the northern coast of the Gulf of Patras, located in western Greece in the province of Aetolia. Again, the Gulf of Patras, that body of water before the entrance into the Gulf of Corinth. So you can see then why Missolonghi was of great strategic importance. So that is our lecture on the horrible massacres that took place on the Greek population. But again, keep in mind that early on, the Greeks themselves were guilty of some horrible, horrific acts on the Turkish population living in the Peloponnese. But the most atrocious um, acts of violence were those committed by the Turks on the Greek population on the islands of Psara, Chios, and in the port city of Missolonghi. Now, next week, we're going to examine how the Greek War of Independence nearly imploded when the Greeks began to fight with one another and an all-out 3-year civil war ensued, of how the Greek cause for liberation from the Ottoman Turks was nearly destroyed and nearly came to an end. So thanks again for joining me this week. I'll see you all again next week on the 16th of April. So until then, take care.